For 40,000 years, the island of Lutruwita, today known as Tasmania, was a world unto itself. It was a land of ancient forests and dramatic coastlines, home to the Palawa, a people whose story was woven into the landscape. They were one of humanity's most isolated populations, their world bounded by the sea. Theirs was a story written over 1,000 generations, a story of resilience and a profound connection to the land that sustained them. But in 1803, the arrival of British ships on the horizon marked the beginning of the end. It brought with it soldiers, convicts, and a crown that saw this ancient land not as a home, but as an empty resource to be claimed. What followed was not a simple colonial settlement. It was a war so brutal, so absolute, and so systematically erased from the popular narrative that it stands as a chilling testament to the darkest capacities of empire. This is the story of Britain's most disturbing colonial war you've never heard of, the Black War. Before it was Van Diemen's Land, a name that would become synonymous with dread and punishment, it was Lutruwita. For at least 40,000 years, the ancestors of the Palawa people lived here, cut off from mainland Australia by rising seas. Theirs was a world woven from an intimate connection to country, a concept so much deeper than just land. Country was everything: the earth, the water, the sky, their spirituality, their knowledge. The Palawa lived in reciprocity with their environment. The land cared for them, and they cared for the land. Before the Europeans arrived, their population was estimated to be somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 people, organised into several distinct nations. They were a people with a deep past, a complex society, and a way of life perfectly in sync with the rugged beauty of their island home. Then, in 1803, that ancient world was shattered. The British arrived not as guests, but as jailers. Van Diemen's Land was established as a penal colony, a dumping ground for the criminals of the British Isles. It was, from its very start, a society built on violence and deprivation. The first interactions with the Palawa were often horrific, marked by the kidnapping of Aboriginal women and children by convicts and by sealers operating in the Bass Strait. These were the first tremors of an earthquake that would soon tear their world apart. The fundamental conflict was over the land itself. The British colonists, backed by their government, didn't see a nurtured and sacred country. They saw empty wilderness, a resource to be tamed and exploited. They saw pasture for sheep, forests for timber, and land to be fenced, owned and subdued. As the colony expanded from its first settlements, the British relentlessly pushed into the rich hunting grounds that had sustained the Palawa for millennia. For the Palawa, this was more than just an invasion, it was a mortal threat. The settlers' sheep drove away the kangaroos, their fences blocked ancient migratory paths, and their very presence desecrated sacred sites. It was an assault on their larders, their homes, and their souls. The flashpoint was competition for resources, but the cultural chasm between the two groups made any peaceful outcome nearly impossible. The British saw the Palawa as primitive nuisances. The Palawa saw the British as the violent invaders who were destroying the world they belonged to. The first major recorded mass killing happened on May 3rd, 1804, at Risdon Cove. A group of around 300 Palawa men, women and children, likely on a kangaroo hunt, appeared near the new settlement. The soldiers panicked and opened fire. Official reports at the time tried to downplay it, but later, accounts from witnesses suggested the death toll was horrifyingly high, with estimates ranging from 3 to as many as 50 people killed. This event, often seen as the start of the Black War, set a terrifying precedent. It showed the colonists were willing to use overwhelming, lethal force against anyone, men, women, and children. For the next decade or so, the violence simmered, but as the settler population exploded and the hunger for land grew more intense around 1824, the sporadic fighting erupted into a full-blown frontier war. It became brutally clear that two worlds, with two utterly incompatible views of the land, could not coexist. One was going to be extinguished. The only question was, which one? Presiding over this escalating crisis was Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, who arrived in 1824. Arthur was a man who perfectly embodied the contradictions of the so-called British civilizing mission. He was a stern, religious military man, obsessed with order and a firm believer in the supremacy of British law. On paper, at least, he talked a big game about equality. One of his first proclamations stated clearly that Aboriginal people were under the protection of the same laws as the settlers. To get this message across, Arthur commissioned one of the most bizarre and tragic artefacts of colonial history, the Proclamation Board. These were painted wooden panels with stick figure-like drawings meant to show the Palawa the supposed impartiality of British justice. One panel shows a white settler and an Aboriginal man living in harmony. The next panels show a white man being hanged for killing an Aboriginal man and an Aboriginal man being hanged for killing a white man. The message was supposed to be simple: we are all equal under the law. But it was a lie, a cruel fiction. While Aboriginal people were indeed hanged for killing settlers, there's little to no evidence of white settlers ever being seriously punished for killing Aboriginal people. The law, in practice, was a one-sided weapon. As the Palawa began to fight back with more and more success, Arthur's thin veneer of enlightened leadership cracked, revealing the iron fist beneath. By 1828, he issued a new proclamation that completely contradicted his earlier message. He ordered the temporary separation of the two populations and commanded all Aboriginal people to leave the settled districts, a huge stretch of their own land. Anyone who wanted to remain needed a special passport. The final decisive step came in November 1828. With the colony gripped by panic, Governor Arthur declared martial law. He officially labelled the Aboriginal people as open enemies of the state, stripping them of any and all legal protection. Arthur himself described martial law as carrying on military operations against the natives. In just 4 years, the government's official position had gone from a fake promise of equality to an open declaration of war. The stage was set for a campaign of unimaginable brutality. The Black War wasn't a conventional war, it was a brutal guerrilla conflict. The Palawa, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, refused to be passive victims. They turned their greatest asset, their encyclopedic knowledge of the rugged Tasmanian landscape, into a powerful weapon. Clans from the Oyster Bay, Big River and North Midlands nations, led by incredible resistance leaders like Tongalongta, Montpeliata and Wybalenna, waged a highly effective campaign. They conducted lightning raids on isolated farms, targeting the symbols of the colonial invasion. They would emerge from the bush as if from nowhere, spear a stockman, seize vital supplies like flour and blankets, and then melt back into the wilderness, leaving the settlers terrified. Their attacks showed a keen strategic mind. They hit the most vulnerable points of the colonial economy and created a constant state of fear. For the isolated settler, every shadow could hide a warrior. Every rustle in the trees could be a prelude to an attack. The colony was in a state of panic. The colonists' response was one of escalating and indiscriminate terror. Fear and revenge fueled the formation of armed roving parties. These were essentially state-sanctioned death squads, often made up of convicts, soldiers and settlers who scoured the countryside hunting for Aboriginal people. Governor Arthur not only approved of these parties but actively encouraged them, issuing hundreds of guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition. The actions of these roving parties were sickening. Their main tactic was to find an Aboriginal camp and attack at dawn, slaughtering people as they slept. Massacres became a common tool of the war. At Cape Grim in February 1828, shepherds working for the Van Diemen's Land Company ambushed a group of about 30 members of the Penamacare clan as they gathered food at the base of a cliff and shot them, throwing their bodies onto the rocks below. There are credible accounts of infants having their brains bashed out. This was not random violence. Historians now see it as part of an organised process to dispossess and destroy specific Aboriginal groups. This was not a war of equals, it was a war of extermination. Over the course of the conflict, it's estimated that between 600 and 900 Aboriginal people were killed, compared to just over 200 colonists. The Palawa were fighting for their survival, but the British were fighting for their extermination. And Governor Arthur, for all his talk of law and order, knew his parties were killing their opponents and just kept sending them out. By 1830, Governor Arthur had had enough. The Palawa warriors' guerrilla tactics were working, the colony was paralysed with fear, and his authority was crumbling. He needed a final dramatic solution, and what he came up with was one of the most bizarre and ambitious military operations in Australian history, the Black Line. The plan was staggering. Arthur mobilised a force of 2,200 men, nearly every available soldier, plus hundreds of convicts and settlers. This army was to form a massive human chain, stretching for hundreds of kilometres across the island. The objective was to sweep eastward across the settled districts, like a giant dragnet, and drive the remaining Aboriginal people, just a few hundred in the region, onto the Tasman Peninsula, where they could be trapped and captured. It was, in its intent, an act of ethnic cleansing, designed to permanently clear the land of its original inhabitants. For weeks in October 1830, this immense human wall of men pushed through dense forests, across rivers and over steep hills. The entire colony held its breath, and the result? An abject, humiliating failure. The Palawa, the masters of this terrain, practically laughed at the clumsy, noisy line of invaders. They slipped through the cordon with ease, often at night, sometimes even doubling back and passing behind the soldiers. Their superior bushcraft made a mockery of Arthur's grand military plan. After weeks of struggle and immense expense, the Great Black Line operation ended. The grand total of their effort: they captured one man and one young boy. The rest had simply vanished back into the bush. It was a catastrophic failure and a profound embarrassment for Governor Arthur. The guerrilla warriors had won the battle, but the war was about to enter its most insidious and tragic phase. The story of the Black Line reveals a critical turning point. It shows the limits of brute force against indigenous resistance. If you're finding this exploration of a hidden part of history compelling, take a moment to subscribe and press the like button. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories out of the shadows. Now, with his military solution in ruins, Governor Arthur turned to a new and far more manipulative strategy. With the failure of the Black Line, the government switched from open force to calculated deception. The face of this new policy was a man named George Augustus Robinson. Robinson was a builder and lay preacher who believed he could succeed where the army had failed. His plan was to go into the bush not with a gun, but with promises of peace, safety, and food. This became known as the Friendly Mission. But Robinson wasn't some lone hero. His mission would have been impossible without a small group of Aboriginal guides and diplomats. Chief among them were Truganini, a Nwenon woman who had witnessed unimaginable violence against her family. Her husband, Wuredi, and Manalarjena, a respected elder and clan leader. They guided Robinson through the wilderness, using their knowledge and kinship ties to make contact with the last free clans. Between 1830 and 1834, Robinson and his companions trekked thousands of kilometres. He approached the starving, hunted remnants of the Palawa and offered them a deal. Here he persuaded them to come in, to surrender peacefully. He gave them his solemn promise that they would be protected, fed and clothed. And most importantly, he assured them that this was all temporary. They would, he promised, eventually be returned to their own country. For the Palawa, who were exhausted and fighting for their very survival, it must have seemed like the only option left. One by one, the clans agreed. Robinson gathered them up, taking all the credit for his powers of persuasion, while relying completely on the skills of his Aboriginal guides. But the promises were a lie. There was never any intention of returning the people to their land. The government's goal wasn't conciliation, it was removal. The survivors of the Black War were now prisoners of the state, their destination an island in the stormy Bass Strait that would become a place of profound suffering and death. The final destination for the Aboriginal people who surrendered was a new Aboriginal establishment called Wybalenna on Flinders Island. The name meant Black Man's House. It was sold as a sanctuary where the Palawa would be civilised and Christianised for their own good. In reality, it was an internment camp, a death trap from which very few would ever return. The conditions were appalling. The people were forced into cramped, unhealthy brick huts, made to wear European clothes and encouraged to smoke tobacco. George Augustus Robinson, now the superintendent, began a systematic campaign to eradicate their culture. He changed their traditional names to absurd European ones like Queen Adelaide and Christopher Columbus, forced them to attend church, and forbade them from speaking their languages or practicing their ceremonies. The psychological toll was immense. Stripped of their freedom, their culture, and their connection to country, the people fell into a deep despair. Homesickness was a physical illness. They had come in peacefully, trusting a promise, and now they were prisoners, watching everything they had ever known being systematically destroyed. Disease ran rampant. Influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis swept through the crowded settlement. Combined with poor sanitation, a bad diet, and the sheer psychological trauma, the death rate was catastrophic. Of the approximately 180 Palawa who were sent to Wybalenna, around 130 died there. Another 25 had already died just getting there. The cemetery grew larger with each passing year. It was slow, agonising, state-sanctioned extinction. Yet even in this horror, they resisted. They practiced their culture in secret. In a remarkable act of defiance, the remaining inhabitants wrote a petition to Queen Victoria in 1847, pleading with her about the broken promises. But it was too little, too late. The establishment was closed, and the 47 survivors were moved again to another squalid camp at Oyster Cove to live out their days. The state's mission to destroy the Palawa people was almost complete. Quick pause, because this story is also about information. For more than a century, a lot of the details around the Black War were pushed into archives, footnotes, and hard-to-find records. Even today, what you see online can depend on where you live, what your ISP filters, or what gets restricted in your region. That's why I use ExpressVPN. It encrypts your connection, protects your privacy, and lets you access the same internet when you're traveling, or when sites are limited where you are. If you want to support the channel and get a deal, you can try ExpressVPN using my link in the description. Now, back to the part of the story that the world tried to erase. The story of the last Tasmanian is a powerful and persistent myth. It centres on Truganini, who died in 1876. For over a century, she was wrongly memorialised as the last of her race. Her death was used to neatly close the chapter on this disturbing part of Britain's history. If the people were extinct, there were no uncomfortable questions to answer, no land to return, no one left to challenge the official story. The genocide could be framed as a sad but inevitable tragedy. But the story of extinction is a lie. It is perhaps the final act of the war, an attempt to erase a people not just from the land, but from existence itself. The Palawa people were never extinct. While the full-blooded population on mainland Tasmania had been decimated, descendants survived, particularly on the Bass Strait Islands, where Aboriginal women and European sealers had formed families. For generations, these communities kept their identity and culture alive, often in the face of intense discrimination and denial. Then, starting in the 1970s, a powerful Aboriginal rights movement began to gain momentum in Tasmania. Activists fought for recognition, for land rights, and for the truth of their history to be told. They asserted their identity not as descendants, but as Palawa, a living people with an unbroken connection to their ancestors. Today, the Palawa community is thriving. The 2021 Australian census recorded over 30,000 people in Tasmania who identified as being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. This resurgence is a powerful testament to their resilience. One of their most incredible achievements has been the revival of their language. From fragmented colonial records and the memories of elders, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre has painstakingly pieced together Palawakani, which means Tasmanian Aborigines speak. It is once again a living language, spoken by elders and taught to children. In 2023, after decades of campaigning, UNESCO was finally forced to remove a disgraceful 1982 document from its website that officially and hurtfully claimed Tasmanians are now an extinct race of humans. The survival and cultural revival of the Palawa people is the final defiant act of the Black War. We come back to the central question: what happened in Tasmania? Was it just a series of tragic misunderstandings, as some have argued? The historian Keith Windshuttle, for example, claims the number of killings was exaggerated, that there's only evidence for about 118 deaths, and that there was no official intent to destroy the Aboriginal people, who were mainly dying from disease. He argues they were more like black bush rangers raiding for supplies, not warriors fighting for their land. Or was it genocide? Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who actually coined the term genocide, specifically cited Tasmania as one of his original examples. Many historians today agree. They argue that the actions of the British, the mass killings, the forced removal, the deliberate destruction of culture, and the creation of lethal living conditions at Wybalenna clearly meet the criteria for genocide under the UN Convention. The goal, they contend, was the intentional destruction of a people in order to clear the land for colonisation. The Black War wasn't just a war on the Palawa people, it was a war on memory itself. For over a century, the British Empire, and later Australia, chose to forget. They buried the massacre lists, romanticised the pioneers, and declared the victims extinct. They did this because the truth is profoundly disturbing. It shows that a supposedly civilised nation was capable of committing the most uncivilised of acts. But the story of Lutruwita and the Palawa people could not be completely erased. It survived in the memories of the descendants, in the scattered fragments of records, and in the land itself. Today, remembering this war is more important than ever. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how our modern world was built, and on whose graves it stands. The war for Tasmania may have ended, but the fight for its memory, and for the justice that memory demands, continues to this day.